Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. And in this programme today we'll be discussing the tragic news that sadly the Israeli Defence Force on Saturday found the bodies of 6 dead Israeli hostages found in a tunnel close to Rafah. So in this programme today we will be discussing the plight of the remaining hostages, and it's particularly poignant as 52 years ago we witnessed the Munich Massacre, where Palestinian terrorists known as Black September murdered 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympic Games in 1972. And we'll be asking, has the world learned anything from Palestinian terrorism? Reagan, it's great to have you back on Behind the Headlines, and it feels like it's been a while since we've done a programme together, so it's good to see you back. I know you just come back from Israel, so just share with us the general mood that Israelis are feeling, particularly that Israel's at war, but also knowing that everything changes so quickly in Israel and the Middle East.
It's a beautiful place, beautiful people, beautiful food, beautiful times. People who impress me continually with their courage in the line of fire, people who continually impress me with their resolve and the good cheer, the fact that life goes on as normal in the day-to-day. While I was there were attacks from Hezbollah on the north particularly. Life continued. People continued about their daily business. Are there frustrations? Yes. Are there fears? Absolutely. Are there trials that people are experiencing the weight of economically? 100%, very definitely. Are there frustrations with Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government? Yes, there are. And yet there is generally a sense of between Jewish and Arab Israelis alike, the ones I was interacting with, a commonality in opposition to Hamas, a resolve in heart and mind that we should and we will bring the hostages home. Even while I was there was exciting news of one man, an Arab Israeli, who was rescued from his captivity in Gaza, and people were extremely excited about that. But now, of course, we are dealing with the tragic reality that so many hostages have lost their lives. Yet again, 6 executed in cold blood. Just this past Sunday morning, their bodies were found.
Yep, so this is just a notice. If you hear some drilling noise, don't worry. It's just some building work that's going on next door, so nothing to be alarmed at. And that's explaining why we're hearing this drilling noise right now. So just to kind of overcap, so clearly on Saturday, the IDF Defence Forces, which had intelligence relating to the capture of the Arab Israeli only a couple of weeks ago, who was rescued, discovered they felt that the area where some Israeli hostages were located, and of course Hamas has changed their strategy now, where they don't want Israel to be jubilant. They don't want to give an IDF victory. So if they, for example, know that the hostages that they hold captive are actually going to be rescued by the IDF, their new policy is to shoot them dead before the Israelis get them, which is barbaric, it's evil, it's horrific. And that's exactly what's happened with these 6 Israelis, 5 Israelis and 1 American dual citizen, so both Israeli and American. So the Jewish News Syndicate, known as JNS, report that the hostages were shot multiple times at close range and that they were executed by the Hamas captors days before discovering, according to the Israeli Ministry of Health, and according to examinations carried out by Abu Kibar Forensic Institute in Tel Aviv. The hostages were murdered between 48 and 72 hours before they were found, meaning that they'd been shot either last Thursday or Friday morning. The tragic news has brought into fresh focus the conduct of the war and the government of Benjamin Netanyahu. And is he doing enough to secure the release of the hostages, as well as ensuring that hundreds of Israeli soldiers have not died in vain whilst fighting against Hamas in Gaza? We see that the primary objective of the IDF is the destruction of Hamas, to ensure that another October the 7th doesn't happen again, but at the same time to bring the hostages home. And a new report has been published indicating that 7,000 Hamas terrorists and residents of Gaza carried out the atrocities on October the 7th in southern Israel. And on the 5th of September 1972, PLO, a terrorist belonging to Black September, stormed the Olympic Village and took 11 Israeli athletes hostage, and they were then murdered the next day. And we'll be asking, have Israel and the world learned anything about Palestinian terrorism over the decades? Because this is a continuation of the Palestinian terror tactic. And of course, we see the families of those who were murdered by Black September back on the 5th of September 1972, literally 52 years ago this week.
And this is, of course, something that's been covered and memorialized in film. The film, very moving in many ways, Munich as well, which some viewers may be familiar with. And yet all too often people have completely, they've given excuses, or there's been the portrayal that some even today have in relation to, I've seen it on social media in regard to even these 6 hostages. They have spoken of them as if they're capital punishments, as if these are individuals who've committed heinous crimes just by the fact that they're Israeli, just by the fact that they are Jews, and that there's been a moral equivalency between their slaying and the other fallouts and consequences of just war following October the 7th. Now, Israel's military primary objective remains the destruction of Hamas and the return of the hostages. There's a lot of pressure, Simon, that's mounting in relation to that primary objective of the destruction of Hamas. Will this be possible? Is it possible? And yet, I think we can look at the change in tactic, which you referenced a minute ago, as seeing potentially some fear, a sense of we're losing ground here, we're going to continue waging this in psychological warfare, we're going to make this more difficult, applying more pressure that will emotionally impact many people in Israel that might save us from total annihilation.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to place and just take a step back and just really place ourselves in Israeli shoes right now for this program. I mean, the devastating and tragic news that 6 Israeli hostages have been murdered in cold blood by the hands of Hamas, and they were alive, so we know that they weren't killed in the aftermath of October the 7th. They've been alive until last week. Is tragic news. It's a huge psychological blow to Israel, and Hamas are maximising this. Now, we have seen, for example, there have been huge protests in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem and a national day of strike in response to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not agreeing to a ceasefire with Hamas over the release of the hostages. And so we know the pain of the families, we know the pain that this causes Israel is unbearable, and particularly being in Israel only last week, Reagan, you can testify to this, that all the Israelis want is to bring their hostages home.
Yes.
So the pain and the trauma is immense. But at the same time, a lot of blame is being put on the shoulders of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for not doing enough to ensure that these hostages remained alive. But whilst Israel has this discussion, you can't take away the fact that Hamas is responsible. Hamas committed the murder of the 6 Israeli hostages, and they're the ones who have done this barbaric and evil act, not the Israeli government, who have been doing everything they can to try and rescue them. And of course, we know from history that once we appease terrorists, then the situation gets worse and worse. We get more terror, we get more violence and more bloodshed. And so therefore, Israel's at that critical stage now where they can't afford to give Israel a lifeline. And this is what makes this military operation in Gaza so impossible, because firstly, as we have rightly said, and you said as well, that the military objective is to destroy Hamas in Gaza, to destroy the infrastructure of Hamas, including the terror tunnels and their arsenal. The other thing is then to find the hostages and release the hostages, but also at the same time providing humanitarian aid to the residents of Gaza and to ensure their safety. Now, this is only the nation of Israel would provide a humanitarian aid corridor to their enemies after what happened on October the 7th. If this was the United States, you can almost guarantee that the whole of Gaza would be pretty much carpet bombed if the same magnitude of the terror attack had occurred on US soil. And so we're looking at Israel being given double standards compared to other nations around the world.
Very much.
And that's what's also coming into play, the complexities of the difficulties of facing a multi-front war, the prospect of a regional war, and the desire to bring the hostages home, but making sure that in doing so, Hamas doesn't have an advantage to be able to rebuild, strengthen itself to carry out a future October the 7th in a few years' time.
Here we are in September, and we're approaching the anniversary of the horrific terror attacks on 9/11. And people talk about 9/11 and the aftermath of that, the war on terror. What Israel experienced on the 7th of October was multiple 9/11s. If you look at population proportion and look at and tally it up, Israel experienced multiple 9/11s on the 7th of October. With the catastrophic loss of life targeting primarily civilians. And now we're reading horrendous stories of how these hostages were executed, shot multiple times in the head, just completely gratuitous in the bloodshed and the manner in which things have been done. Video footage even released of final messages, is how Hamas has put it, from these hostages as well, just ramping up the psychological war nature. The hostages who had been abducted by Hamas alive on the 7th of October were recovered from a tunnel in southern Gaza's Rafah overnight, shortly after they were murdered by terrorists. The figures range, but it's within about 48 hours of their murder, according to the Israel Defense Forces. The hostages were Hirsch Goldberg Polin, 23 years of age, Eden Yerushalmi, 24, Ori Danino, 25, Alex Lobanov, 32, Carmel Gat, 40, and Almog Sarusi, 27. The Hirsch Goldberg, Polin Yerushalmi, Lobanov Sarusi, and Danino, who was an off-duty non-commissioned officer, were abducted from the Nova Music Festival near Kibbutz Re'im, while Gat was taken from Kibbutz Be'eri. Their bodies were found with multiple gunshot wounds, according to Israel's health ministry, citing an examination carried out by Abu Kabir Forensic Institute. The ministry said the hostages were murdered between 48 and 72 hours before their autopsy, meaning between Thursday and Friday morning. IDF spokesman said their bodies were found during the fighting in Rafah in a tunnel about a kilometer away from the tunnel from which we rescued Farhan al-Khadi a few days ago.
And the IDF said it did not have the exact location of the hostages, but had indications of the general area where the six could be held, and it was therefore operating very carefully in that area. And they said that since Farhan was found, troops were given an emphasis on operating carefully, even more than usual, because of the understanding of the additional hostages may be in that area. We did not have information on the exact location of the hostages, said Hagari, the IDF spokesman. Do you want to tell us who the hostages were? Because, I mean, their story is tragic. And, I mean, to be caught on October the 7th, then taken back as hostages to Israel is horrific. Of course, Hirsch Goldberg, we heard from his mother in Jerusalem at the media center in Jerusalem, organized by the government press office. We've heard her speak so elegantly and so passionately about her son and the hostages. And it's just tragic that he hasn't come home. There was a picture released by Hamas of him, of saying he had a hand that's been amputated. Obviously, he lost his hand in the attack on October the 7th. I think it was when Hamas threw grenades at a bomb shelter that he was in, and him and his friend were throwing the grenades out, but this one blew his hand off. And to survive that and then to continue to survive until last week is beyond tragic.
Throughout Israel, his face is portrayed in graffiti and in posters, not just with the slogan, bring them home, but specifically bring Hirsch home, as so many hostages who had previously been rescued or released had testified to how even under these extreme circumstances he was in, he had been a beacon of light to those who he encountered, even sharing the meager rations that they were provided with others. Hirsch Goldberg Pollen was 23. He was born in the U.S. before immigrating to Israel with his parents at the age of 7. His parents, John Pollen and Rachel Goldberg. He attended the Nova Music Festival, where his arm was injured during the terror attack. As you said, his hand was blown off by a grenade. On April 24th, Hamas released a video of Hirsch showing his amputated hand. Alexander Lobanov, 32, is from the coastal city of Ashkelon. He was also kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival, where he worked as a bar manager. Mr. Lobanov leaves behind 2 children, a 2-year-old and a 5-month-old who was born while he was in captivity. Testimonies indicate that he helped evacuate people and ran with 5 others in the Be'eri forest. While they escaped, he was captured, according to the hostages forum. Carmel Gat, 40, was kidnapped from Kibbutz Be'eri, where she was visiting her parents, Ishel and Kinneret. Miss Gat was an occupational therapist full of compassion and love, always finding ways to support and help others. She loved solo travel, meeting new people, live rock music concerts, and was particularly fond of Radiohead, the hostages forum said. Almog Sarusi, 27, from the central Israeli city of Ra'anana, was kidnapped from the Nova Festival also. He attended the festival with his girlfriend Shahar, who was killed by terrorists during the massacre. The hostages forum described him as a vibrant, positive person who loved traveling around Israel in his white Jeep with his guitar. Mr. Sarusi was the son of Yigal and Nira and brother to Amit. Eden Yerushalmi, 24, from Tel Aviv, was kidnapped from the Nova Festival, where she worked as a bartender. The hostages forum said Ms. Yerushalmi called the police during the terror attack, describing the situation and pleading, "Find me, okay?" It added, for 4 hours afterwards, she spoke with her sisters May and Shani, who heard everything she went through as she tried to escape. Her last words were, "Shani, they've caught me." Miss Yerushalmi was described as a vibrant young woman with many friends and hobbies. Eden loved spending summer days at the beach, playing paddleball, attending parties, and studying to become a Pilates instructor. She leaves 2 siblings, May and Shani, and her parents, Sharit and Maor. Ori Danino, 25, from Jerusalem, was also kidnapped from Nova, driving back to help others escape and survive. Mr. Danino was the son of Einav and Elkanan, the eldest of 5 siblings, and partner to Liel. He planned to begin his academic studies in electrical engineering, was known for his ambition, love for people, and was beloved by all. He loved nature and was very handy, according to the forum.
And so we need to pray for the families of the hostages who've just discovered that their loved ones have been murdered in cold blood by Hamas. And sadly, the silence of the world is deafening, especially from the British government, who has, as of this recording today, their first day back in Parliament, decided to suspend Israeli military aid, which is a damning indictment on this government. But let's have a look at this excellent news report put together by our friends at CBN, reporting on the loss and the death and the murder of these 6 Israeli kidnapped hostages.
A few hours ago, we informed the families that the bodies of their loved ones had been located by IDF troops in an underground tunnel in Rafah. According to our initial assessment, they were brutally murdered by Hamas terrorists shortly before we reached them.
The nation is mourning as 6 hostages, including American citizen Hirsch Goldberg Pollen, were found murdered in Gaza. Just a few days before this tragic discovery, Hirsch's mother, Rachel, stood at the Gaza border shouting a blessing to her son.
May God bless you and keep you. May God shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. And may God give you peace.
The brutal killing sparked outrage, and today protesters are planning a nationwide strike as some Israelis blame Prime Minister Netanyahu for not being willing to approve a ceasefire deal. But Netanyahu says a deal must have acceptable terms, and Israel must be able to stop Hamas from attacking Israel again.
The fact that Hamas is continuing to perpetrate atrocities like those it carried out on October 7th requires us to do everything so that it will be unable to perpetrate these atrocities again.
Amidst the grief, Israeli children returned to school on Sunday.
Mixed emotions. On one hand, we are happy to be back at some routine. On the other hand, we can still hear the booms in the background. We hope, at least for the kids, for some normal routine.
On Sunday, a drive-by shooting near Hebron left 3 Israeli police officers dead. IDF forces tracked down the shooter, who was killed in a subsequent gun battle. The terrorist was a member of the Palestinian Presidential Guard, a force that receives significant U.S. funding and training. Sunday's incident raises questions about the effectiveness of U.S.-funded security programs in the region. Israeli officials also say Hamas cannot be trusted.
I believe the whole attitude towards Hamas must change by the world community and by the interlocutors, by Arab nations, by intermediaries. They all have to understand that Hamas is not a partner to anything.
As Israel navigates these multiple crises, attention remains focused on the hostages still in captivity. Israel reports that 101 hostages remain in Gaza, with only 66 believed to be alive. The ongoing challenge is securing their release and safe return. Reporting from Israel, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Well, let's look at some reactions from around the world to the murder of these hostages in Gaza. We have Hirsch Goldberg Pollen. Among those found on Saturday was Hirsch Goldberg Pollen, an American Israeli who was seen alive with a hand missing. Proof of life video published by Hamas earlier this year. In a brief statement, Hirsch Goldberg Pollen's family had dual U.S.-Israeli citizenship, and they said that they had broken hearts. The Goldberg Pollen family is devastated to announce the death of their beloved son and brother Hirsch, they said in an announcement. And the family thanks you for all your love and support and asks for privacy at this time.
Which is, I mean, we just saw in that excellent news report by CBN there, Rachel Goldberg, praying the Aaronic blessing over her son. And yeah, I mean, this is something that we all need to continue to increase our prayers for, that the remaining hostages would come home. We also see that one of the hostages that was murdered by Hamas, Gat, the cousin Gil Dickerman, who is a prominent voice in those campaigning for the release of the hostages, called on the public to go to the streets. And he said, "The nightmare came true. It was in our hands. Get out of your homes to stop the next murder." We also see a response by the Israeli president, Isaac Herzog. In a statement, he said, "Heart of an entire nation is crushed into pieces with the announcement of the death of the hostages. In the name of the entire state of Israel, I hold their families in my heart and ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness for not being able to return your loved ones home safely," he said. The Israeli Defense Minister, Yaval Gallant, said, "During this painful and difficult time, my thoughts and my heart are with the families of the hostages who were killed." And then we see that US President Joe Biden has said that he's devastated and outraged by the deaths of the hostages, in particular that of the dual US-Israeli citizen Goldberg Polin, whose parents, John and Rachel, he and other Americans were in their prayer. He said this, "I worked tirelessly to bring their beloved Hirsch safely to them, and I'm heartbroken by the news of his death. It is as tragic as it is reprehensible. Make no mistake, Hamas leaders will pay for those crimes, and we will keep working around the clock for a deal to secure the release of the remaining hostages." Bit of a contradiction in that statement, because because the whole attitude of President Biden has been to protect Hamas.
He has worked tirelessly for it.
And his opposition to Israel's military offensive into Rafah, where these hostages were held. Had it been the Biden administration's will, that of the British government, the Israeli forces wouldn't have gone into Rafah. So there wouldn't have been any chance to have rescued these hostages. So the fact is, this is very much a mixed message. Obviously, he's concerned that Hirsch Goldberg is an American citizen, so this looks badly on the United States. But at the same time, we know that America's policies, particularly their policies towards Israel, is actually preventing Israel from fully destroying Hamas in Gaza, and Israel's having to fight with one hand behind their back.
Actions speak louder than words. And here we have Kamala Harris, who is by no means to be trusted, and most will know that in relation to this situation. She has given her condolences and reiterated that Hamas now has even more American blood on its hands. Doug and my prayers are with John Pollan and Rachel Goldberg Pollan, Hirsch's parents, and with everyone who knew and loved Hirsch, Harris said in a statement. When I met with John and Rachel earlier this year, I told them, "You are not alone. That remains true as they mourn this terrible loss," she said. Hamas is an evil terrorist organization. With these murders, Hamas has even more American blood on its hands. But the problem, Kamala, is that were it up to you and were it up to President Biden, Israel would be on its own in many ways. In relation specifically to Rafah, there were all sorts of threats on what would happen if Israel dared to launch an offensive into Rafah. That offensive has, to all intents and purposes, been a massive success in many, many ways. And there have been hostages rescued. Tragically, these were killed. It hasn't been helped that the USA has continued to put pressure on Israel, that the U.S. government has continued to victim blame and has continued to in some way insinuate that Israel is the one that needs to be doing more to procure a deal, even though, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reminded, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has routinely this year praised and congratulated Israel for offering very generous deals multiple times, to which Hamas has declined response. Israel has taken the process seriously. Hamas has not even showed up with a delegation. Who's not taking this seriously here? It's Hamas. Why? Because Hamas doesn't actually want peace. And in the words of Psalm 120, I am for peace, they are for war. That applies to this situation.
Absolutely. So let's watch this very heartbreaking video by one of Israel's spokesmen belonging to the Israeli Defense Force, announcing the news that 6 Israeli hostages were sadly found dead in a terror tunnel in Rafah in Gaza over the weekend.
It is with a heavy heart that we share the news that the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages, who were all taken hostage alive by Hamas during the October 7th massacre and murdered in Hamas captivity, were recovered from inside a tunnel in Rafah and have been brought back to Israel. Hirsch Goldberg Pollan, age 23, an Israeli-American citizen. Eden Yerushalmi, age 24. Ori Danino, age 25. Almog Sarusi, age 27. Alexander Lubanov, age 33, and a father of 2, were all abducted from the Nova Music Festival, and Carmel Gat, age 40, who was abducted from Be'eri on October 7th. Israeli security forces brought back their bodies to Israel for burial. At this stage, we assess that the hostages were murdered by Hamas terrorists shortly before our soldiers were able to reach them inside the tunnel in Rafah. Our hearts go out to the families at this difficult time. On October 7th, Hirsch, Eden, Ori, Almog, Alexander, and Carmel were dancing at a music festival, celebrating life, living their lives when thousands of Hamas terrorists invaded Israel, seeking their death. Hamas continues to hold 101 hostages, including women, children, and the elderly, in brutal conditions inside Gaza. We will not rest until we fulfill our mission of bringing all our hostages home, by all means possible.
Well, we want to thank the IDF for their efficiency in presenting these reports and, of course, for their service, which they're doing on behalf, as we've said many times, not only of Israel, but on behalf of all who love freedom and all who love the Jewish people.
But this is something that, I mean, for example, our government now has taken an increasingly hostile position towards Israel, particularly with the stopping 30 military licenses for rearming of Israel's military, or rearming and selling weapons to Israel. Is a kind of fact that they don't understand that what's happening in Israel, and Israel's war against Hamas, Israel's war against Hezbollah, against Palestinian Islamic Jihad, against the Houthis, against the Iranian regime, this same evil, if it were allowed to be destroy Israel, which it won't, because we know what the psalmist says, that he who watches over Israel neither stumbles nor sleeps. God will not allow the destruction of Israel, and Israel is the only nation in the world where their future is guaranteed. No other nation has that security. So we know that despite the enemies of Israel amassing to destroy her, Israel's going nowhere. We can't say that of Britain, we can't say that of Europe, we can't say that of the United States. And if Israel is not allowed to destroy this demonic, evil ideology that is Hamas, it will come after the West. And the similar scenarios that we've seen in Israel will be outplayed in Europe and in North America, because we are not allowing Israel to confront this evil. So the same bloodshed that's been shed in Israel will be shed abroad, because he who blesses Israel will be blessed, but those who curse Israel will be cursed. God is really bringing the nations of the world into judgment over the treatment of his people. And despite the fact we've got world leaders condemning the murder of these hostages, these are kind of hollow words if it's not backed up by action. And so for Israel's long-term survival, Israel needs to destroy Hamas, and for the safety of Europe and the West, Israel also needs to destroy Hamas, and the Western governments need to allow Israel to do that and back Israel in this war against Hamas and Hezbollah, which is backed up by the Iranian regime.
Yeah. The pressure is not only from outside, there is pressure internally now. Granted, emotional tension is very high at the moment. People, as we've already said, they simply and understandably want the hostages home. However, previously when we've seen prisoners released for hostages, that has created massive fallout and massive challenges with terror attacks and more loss of life than those who've been released. And so there's a lot that has to be weighed up. And is there a winning situation here? I don't know that there is in one sense, but we're seeing on Sunday Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, calling on Mr. Netanyahu's security cabinet to drop its veto of a peace deal. Thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets in cities across the country, particularly in Tel Aviv, chanting now, now, in reference to a possible ceasefire and a deal that would see the hostages released. A deal needs to be reached. A deal is more important than anything else. Anan Bar David, the leader of the union, called a general strike, said on Sunday night. Now, there was a strike, fairly short-lived, on Monday before a court struck its legality down. It was the first since the October the 7th attacks. It was set to begin at 6 a.m. local time, with Ben Gurion Airport halting all flights starting at 8 a.m. Nurseries, universities, and a number of large shopping centers to be closed as well. But after about 2:30 p.m., everything was reopened again due to some legal interventions. On Sunday night, demonstrators blocked the main way into Jerusalem while hundreds protested outside the Prime Minister's office in the city. That's been going on for a period of time. It was happening when I was there during Pesach. It was happening just recently. And there is a very common sentiment among the Israeli populace, one that I sympathize with to a large degree, asking the question, is it possible for Hamas to be completely eradicated? Is this a pipe dream? Is this something that is at all achievable? Yes, destabilization, yes, complete dismantling of its military capabilities for at least a period of time, yes, the righteous execution of some of its leaders, but we're talking about an ideology, Simon, and the reality is that if Hamas is destroyed and loses power and another takes its place, there are tens of terror cells and groups of varying strands within Gaza that are just as bad. Perhaps, God forbid, there's some group out there that's even worse.
The question you have to ask yourself, and this is the important equation, is that it's important to strike the head of the snake, and the head of the snake is the Iranian regime.
Yes.
You bring about regime change in Iran, then all this funding for Hamas, for Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, there is not that state intelligence that is provided to them, particularly also on behalf of the Qatari government as it relates to Hamas, will be absent. The funding into these terror organizations will stop, and essentially they will dry up. And that was what's happening back in 2019 with the Trump administration in power in the White House. We had that situation. But of course, when you pacify and you deal with Hamas, it just empowers them and emboldens them. So the question is, Israel has to eradicate Hamas in Gaza, and if that means in some way dividing Gaza into three, if that means putting Israeli troops on the border, the Rafah crossing, known as also the Philadelphia corridor between Israel and Gaza and Egypt, then Israel has to do that. In order to stop the supply of weapons coming in, because the last thing we want, as in 2014 with Israel's last military operation against Hamas, is that they built up new terrorist infrastructure. After the war stopped, billions were pumped into Gaza. The Hamas didn't use to build schools. They didn't use this to build roads, didn't use this to build business hubs and create hotels and restaurants to improve the lives of the residents of Gaza. What did they do with that money? They bought this money on sophisticated weapons, 300-mile terror tunnel network to carry out their next mass terrorist attack against Israel, which they did on October the 7th. So this is the sad thing that the Israelis have to grip with, that the lesson is that if you appease terrorism, you get more terrorism and you get more violence. And so the only way for Israel is to be strong now, resolute, and just back the Prime Minister on this occasion to do the job and finish the job, and to destroy as much as Hamas as they possibly can, and certainly capture Sinwar. That's got to be a first priority, and stop releasing Palestinian terrorists as prisoners, who then later go on to positions of leadership and carry out horrific murders and terrorism like Hamas have under the leadership of Sinwar, who was actually held as a prisoner by Israel a few years ago.
And even treated freely in an Israeli hospital for cancer. And these are individuals who have been looked after to some degree, not to mention the fact of the exchange and they're being given a chance of freedom. It is believed that 97 of the 251 hostages abducted by Hamas on October the 7th now remain in Gaza, including the bodies of at least 33 confirmed dead by the IDF. Hamas released 105 civilians during a week-long truce in late November, and 4 hostages were released before that. 8 hostages have been rescued by troops alive, and the bodies of 37 hostages have also been recovered, including 3 mistakenly killed by the military as they tried to escape their captors. Hamas is also holding 2 Israeli civilians who entered the Strip in 2014 and 2015, as well as the bodies of 2 IDF soldiers who were killed in 2014. Now, it's important to consider why it is that ceasefire talks have continually collapsed, and this ultimately points back to who controls the Philadelphia corridor of Gaza. The failure of Israel and Hamas to reach agreement, the Telegraph reports on who controls the Philadelphia corridor, blamed for a collapse of ceasefire talks. The killing of 6 Israeli hostages whose bodies were found in a tunnel on Thursday is being partially blamed on Benjamin Netanyahu's government for failing to reach a ceasefire deal. Critics claim the cabinet decided not to save the hostages when it voted to keep control of a buffer zone known as the Philadelphia corridor, separating Gaza from Egypt. The issue of who will remain in control of the corridor has been one of the main focus points of recent ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas, with the terror group insisting that Israel withdraws fully from Gaza. The Philadelphia corridor is 14 kilometers, 8.6 miles long, running south from the Mediterranean Sea along the Gaza-Egyptian border. Israel took control of the corridor in May when forces invaded the city of Rafah. Until then, 750 Egyptian forces had been in control of the zone as per the peace agreement between Jerusalem and Cairo in 2005 when Israel withdrew from Gaza. The purpose of the Egyptian forces controlling the border was to prevent infiltration and combat terrorism, but when Hamas took control of Gaza in 2007, Egypt failed to secure the border.
And of course, you and I have been to the car park, one of three, that was devastated by Hamas on October the 7th, mainly the party goers of the Nova Music Festival. We saw the cars shot up with bullets. We saw them burnt to nothing but a shell of the cars and motor vehicles that were used, that were murdered by Hamas on that day. And it was there where you realised the magnitude of the weapons that were used by Hamas could only come in from Egypt. So, for example, in any future agreement, Israel security is at stake, and so therefore Israelis have to control the Philadelphia corridor in order to prevent more weapons and arms being smuggled in from Egypt via Rafah into Gaza to allow Hamas to rearm. So this is absolutely essential for determining the future not only of Gaza, but also the future of Israel's security as well.
Now, last month, the IDF said it had destroyed 50 underground tunnels in the corridor, in which we're speaking, some of which were crossing into Egypt, Simon, but both Hamas and Egypt have voiced opposition to Israeli forces keeping control of the corridor, saying that's been their stance since the start of the negotiations. The official from Egypt who's speaking to Ynet, an Israeli news outlet, said also that Egypt had sealed most of the tunnels under the buffer zone with water and flooded them with concrete to prevent the smuggling of weapons, goods, and spare parts. And yet we know there's plenty of evidence that shows widespread support for Hamas in Egypt, even collaboration.
And what about the size of these tunnels? Literally motorways.
Yes.
Going from Egypt into Israel. So we know that the Egyptian authorities turned a blind eye.
We're not talking about Great Escape-like tunnels.
No, we're talking motorway tunnels. We're talking about, going through, just unbelievable sized tunnels.
We've seen the images.
Yeah.
Massive.
So enough to get a lot of vehicles through, enough to get a lot of weapons through, and this is why, unfortunately, the Egyptian government hasn't seemed to be trustworthy on this one. But also we know that many of the Egyptian security guards would have been bribed to allow the smuggling in of all these weapons and be paid a much higher salary by Hamas than the Egyptian government could ever do. So it doesn't make sense for the Egyptians to control the Philadelphia corridor. It also says that following the news of the death of the 6 hostages, 3 of whom were on the list of those expected to be released through a ceasefire, Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, said that, in cabinet that they must gather immediately and reverse the decision made on Thursday. Mr. Gallant was the only cabinet member to vote against the decision to keep forces along the corridor. While the ceasefire talks are expected to resume this week, it's unclear whether the latest decision by the Israeli government on the corridor will cause Hamas to stop negotiations. The terror group has previously warned that the talks were on the brink of collapse because of Israel's demands, including control of the Philadelphia corridor. Now, if Israel concedes the Philadelphia corridor, you're just giving a green light for future terrorist attacks by Hamas. You're allowing a green light for rearmament of Hamas through the Rafah crossing. Again, you're just looking at another October the 7th, maybe in a decade time. Nothing changes.
And this is the difficulty of it, Simon. Israel is in a devastating situation economically at the moment. Following the pandemic and leading up to the present, between the end of restrictions on the pandemic and October the 7th, there was about 8 months of quality, normal resumption of everyday life in Israel. The tourism industry hit massively, people across society from all strands hurting a great deal. And so what's influencing many people here is this idea that more funds, more money spent, taken from the common populace to secure a border, to hem in Gaza, to keep terrorists at bay, even though we know the ideology will continue and it will run rampant. There's also distrust as a result of what happened on October the 7th, when despite an amazing security system, despite an excellent wall, despite top class technology as well and intel, 7,000 terrorists were able to breach the border and were able to massacre about 1,200 individuals, primarily Israeli citizens, and run rampant throughout the area. In fact, I was talking with a pastor of a church near, not too far from Ashkelon, and he was communicating with me one day over lunch on my recent visit that were it not for the Nova Music Festival, the music festival is actually what hindered and kept so many of the terrorists from making more inroads. If that music festival had not been happening on this occasion, they could very easily, he said, made it into Ashkelon, Ashdod, and potentially started making inroads into Tel Aviv. We have 7,000, a catastrophically high number of terrorists who managed to access Israeli territory and run rampant. So we can see and we can praise God that it was not worse than it was, but we're talking about the equivalent, as we said earlier, of multiple 9/11s in regard to population proportion. And the people are reeling from this in such a way that they're wondering, is the time, is the investment, is the control even of that corridor worth it? Or is it going to be breachable? Is it going to be successful in some way? This is some of the controversy that people need to talk
the big
through.
question is, and this is just purely from a military perspective,
Yes.
giving you now for Reagan, is that if you stop the weapons coming in from Egypt,
Right.
then you stop the rearmament of Hamas.
Right.
It is that simple.
Yeah.
But the question is, and this is the emotional problem that Netanyahu and the current Israeli government face, is the emotional pressure to do everything they can in order to give Hamas exactly what it wants in order to release the hostages. Now, let's just say, and I'm speaking hypothetically now, there is an agreement that Hamas agree to releasing some hostages, and it will only be a few, it won't be many, and that they would gain control of the Philadelphia corridor. If that happens, then know that Hamas has won, because there is nothing then stopping them from rearming.
Right.
But the emotional situation in Israel is so much that they want the hostages home no matter what the cost.
Yes.
But they don't realize by doing this,
More will die.
More will die in the future, and we'll see a repeat of October the 7th, because it's all about now. And of course, yes, Israel needs to bring those hostages home. But if it means that Israel's security and a future October the 7th will happen, if they don't, then it's essential that Israel keeps the Philadelphia corridor. But going back to what you said, this report is absolutely shocking. It's just been released by JNS, the Jewish News Syndicate, that 7,000 Hamas terrorists and residents took part in Gaza on October the 7th. And the report goes as follows. It says that Palestinians breached the border through 119 holes they created in the fence separating Israel from the Strip. Some 7,000 Gazans participated in the Hamas-led October the 7th assault on southern Israel, according to new Israeli Defense Force estimates. The data is based on in-depth investigation conducted by the IDF's Gaza division. Channel 12 reported on Saturday the findings were submitted to IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Herezi Halevi. According to the assessment, double the number of Gazans infiltrated the northwestern Negev on that day that had been previously believed. Some 3,800 terrorists from Hamas terror groups, elite Nakba forces, who led the invasion, followed by 2,200 terrorists and looters from Gaza. Around 1,000 other terrorists participated in the attack from within the Gaza Strip, firing some 4,300 rockets and assisting the forces that crossed into Israeli territory. The terrorists breached the border at 119 points, around double the figure of 60 breaches previously reported. The initial figures made public indicate that some 3,000 Hamas terrorists and Gazan civilians had infiltrated Israeli territory and participated in the mass killings, kidnapping, looting and destruction, and other atrocities and sexual assaults. Some 1,200 people were murdered on October the 7th, thousands more wounded, 251 kidnapped to Gaza, to whom 101 remain in captivity. So let's look at this video produced by the Israeli Foreign Ministry that also says that residents of Gaza are also responsible for the horrors of October the 7th.
In Gaza, the involvement of local residents in harbouring Israeli hostages has raised grave concerns. Civilians who looted Israeli communities, kidnapped, lynched and even raped Israelis are now implicated in sheltering hostages in their homes. Abdallah al-Jamal, an Al Jazeera contributor, has been exposed as a Hamas operative. On June 8th, in a daring mission, the IDF rescued hostages held in his home. These acts highlight the deep involvement of some Gaza residents in the cycle of violence and the ongoing conflict. As we look for solutions, the role of local residents in these tragic events cannot be overlooked. The path to peace requires confronting these harsh realities.
With many thanks to the Israeli Foreign Ministry for their allowance of our using that video. It just goes to show, Simon, and this is something we've been talking about, trying to raise awareness of for almost a year. It's almost a year since this atrocity happened, that Gazan civilians were complicit in these attacks. It's a tragic reality that there's been so much trust that has been given, that was given prior to October the 7th, to so many who betrayed that trust.
17,000.
You know, this is what we're talking about. Yep. And so we're seeing a serious issue in which the future and future opportunity for normalization of relationship, it looks very bleak.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, there's 17,000 residents of Gaza were permitted to enter into Israeli territory to work on the kibbutzes that were destroyed. And of course, most of them did an intelligence recce on Israel and gave Hamas all the intel they needed in order to carry out the horrors of October the 7th. But the other question is, and this is what the rest of the world believes, that the residents of Gaza are innocent. At this one. That's why they call them innocent civilians. But as we know, and the amount of residents of Gaza who took part in the terror and the massacre of October the 7th was 7,000, which is huge. Yeah. And how much of the residents of Gaza support Hamas? It's huge. So therefore, you can only conclude that it's like saying, do you support the Nazis? I'm not a Nazi, but do you support them? Yeah, I voted for them. I support them, so therefore you are sympathetic to the Nazi cause, therefore you're a Nazi. The same with the residents of Gaza as well. And I think it's very poignant as well that this week, on the 5th of September, marks the 52nd anniversary of the Munich Massacre, the Olympic Games in 1972, where Black September, a Palestinian terror organization associated with the PLO, carried out the massacre against Israeli athletes who were competing in the 1972 Olympics. 11 Israelis were actually murdered at those games. And that's the lesson. It's the Israeli security forces wanted to move in. The German authorities said, no, let us handle it. And of course, we see another tragic in Munich. We had the Munich rallies in the 1930s. And then 40 years later, in 1972, we have this horrific terrorist attack that occurred on German soil against the Israelis. And many of the athletes competing were also Holocaust survivors. And that was very difficult for them to compete, knowing the horrors that took place in Germany only 4 decades earlier.
Emotionally, it's doubtless incredibly difficult. One cannot even imagine, unless they're in those shoes themselves, the difficulty of the families of those remaining Israeli hostages still held in Gaza by Hamas. And our thoughts and our prayers and our pleading before the Lord must be for them and on their behalf. And yet the plight of these hostages must not be used as a political weapon against the current Israeli government. That's playing right into Hamas's hands. And it's unfortunate that the reality is, yes, there may be concerns, other concerns, that there are people who are bringing other concerns they have outside of the war to these protests, things that are maybe related in some way economically, perhaps to a large degree. They're bringing those into this situation and using the hostages as a way of going against the current government. Are there things that one can say that have been said about the current Israeli government and its members? Absolutely. No government is without fault in some way. But on this, we agree, Simon, that there's no other way. There's no other way than to continue with the military objectives that are there. Anything else is to show Hamas that concessions can be made, and that kill hostages, get concessions. Okay, the more we kill, the more, more concessions.
But the sad thing is that Israel's humanity is their weakness. Their compassion and their love is a weakness, not only for the hostages, but also for the residents of Gaza as well. And they would love nothing more than for Gaza to become a peace haven. They would nothing more to allow business investment into Gaza, to provide jobs for the Gazans, to live in cooperation, to live at peace with those in Gaza. But we know that the Gazans are indoctrinated with a demonic, evil ideology that's directly out of the pit of hell, which is a mixture of Islamism and Nazism. And of course we saw the terror of that unfold on October the 7th. And I think for those soldiers as well, over 300 soldiers who have died fighting against Hamas in Gaza, it's imperative that Israel does not concede the Philadelphia corridor, or their lives will also be in vain. So it's important to take into account the families of the hostages and the soldiers as well, and say that Israel needs to destroy Hamas and then start to build a better future for the residents of Gaza, who will then be freed of this terror organization that is Hamas.
Absolutely. So for our viewers, we ask that you continue to please pray for the remaining hostages in Gaza, for the families, especially right now. Please remember the families of those who have lost loved ones even in this past week. Pray for God's justice to reign, and pray that the Lord would work His wonders in bringing deliverance to all the hostages and bringing victory to Israel. God bless you and keep you.